So on today's session, we'll be talking about the do's and don'ts of front-end documentation. And as I introduced myself earlier, I am Hillary Nyaykundi. I prefer to call myself a growing developer because I believe that every day is a learning day, and in the tech industry or in the tech community, you never stop learning. So that's why I've always preferred to refer myself as a growing developer. I am passionate about technology and open source at large, and I am a lover of Python programming language and the Django framework. That's where I major. I am also a tech writer and a blog, currently writing articles for FreeCodeCamp and doing my personal blog on dev.to and Hashnode. And I also do host a podcast known as Let's Talk Developer, where I get to interview developers from around the globe so that they get to share their journey and hopefully inspire the upcoming developers by sharing tips on how to get started so that they too can reach a level where they have reached. And you can also reach to me via Twitter. What front-end development is. So I believe most developers, as per se, almost every developer personally included in the list, at some point we have done some front-end development, that is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and even used the React framework to do our projects, because that's the journey most developers tend to begin with. So for front-end development, we can define front-end development as this is where developers get to build the visible parts of a website. And these are the things that you as a user interacts with whenever you visit a website. And in order for you to become a front-end developer, there's some skills which you need to have. That is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, in order for you to understand these, you need to learn them. And in learning them, you need to understand a few basic things about it. So for example, when learning HTML, you'll have to understand that in a real example, we can define HTML as a skeleton or body because it gives the website its structure. Every site you visit today, it is built using HTML beneath it. And we also have CSS. You can think of CSS as the muscles of your body. Take your body, for instance. Now, in web development, CSS can be compared to the muscles of your body. CSS makes a site beautiful and interesting to look at. Just like your body, where the muscles and skin make you beautiful, CSS does the same for the websites. And on the other hand, JavaScript is like the brain of the operation that tells you everything that, in this case, JavaScript tells the website how to behave. In short, JavaScript enables you to add functionality to your website. Now, let's assume that you want to take the front-end developer path. There's some responsibilities that come in handy for you as a front-end developer. Just like any other role we have in the development industry, each developer role has some responsibilities that come in handy. So the responsibility of a front-end developer include like collaborating with designers and application developers to develop customized website which will be productive to the user or to the person who will be using them. Also develop sites that are a wide array of contents and ensure optimal utilization of web tools. Well, this can be used mainly by let's say when developing websites, by making good use and utilizing the resources which are available, like the front-end frameworks you have like React, making good use of those and utilizing them to make sure that your project is good. Also, you should, as a responsibility of a front-end developer, you should be able to build reusable code for future use. I'm sure not every developer enjoys writing code over and over again. So writing a code that you'll be able to reuse in the future or in some time will be really comes in handy for this kind of developer, because most of the designs you'll be building might be similar, and trying to write the code over and over again might not be a good idea. So for you, having that code to reuse it in future will be really advantageous for you. Another point is for you to ensure that the web designs are responsive and work well on all devices. Well, most of the community, most of the users of our products as websites, most of them tend to browse them from their mobile phones. So it's your responsibility as a front-end developer to make sure that the website you have built is accessible from any device that can be used to access it. Let's say, be it a desktop, be it a laptop, be it a mobile phone, be it a tablet, your website should be able and accessed from all the devices we have. That's what we mean by making sure that your website is responsive. Work with the creative teams to develop innovative solutions to cater for a wider audience. Well, let's take this for instance as a working in hand with designers like the UI UX designers to make sure that your website is eye-catchy to the audience. I'm sure not everybody will be very pleased if they visit a website and the website doesn't have any styling in it. I'm sure as a client or as a person trying to visit a website, if you visit a website that is not well styled, you will not even spend more than a minute on the site. So your work as a front-end developer is to make sure that you work closely with the team that is behind the UI UX design to make sure that your website has an appealing look. And finally, the last responsibility is to write a clear, detailed documentation to help explain to the users what your website is all about. So that's what we are going to talk here today. We are going to look exactly at how you'll be able to write a clear documentation that won't cause any problems for a user trying to navigate through your product. It will be easier for the user to understand what exactly your product is all about, and it will be good for both parties. You'll be able to get clients to use your product, and the user will be happy as they try to read along the documentation which you have provided. So we have seen what front-end development is. We have seen some of the skills that you are required as a developer to have in order to become a front-end developer. Now we have seen the responsibilities that come in handy as a front-end developer. We are also, one of the responsibility we saw is that be able to write a clear documentation that will be well understood to the user who will be using your product. Now let's take a step higher and try to understand what exactly is documentation. What do we mean when we talk about documentation? Documentation can be defined as a written text or illustration that accompanies computer software or is embedded in the source code. The documentation either explains how the software operates or how to use it, and may mean different things to people in different roles. So what exactly do I mean by this? So I'm sure most of us, we have purchased stuff online. We have purchased maybe, let's say, softwares like Windows. I'm sure when you purchase something, it usually comes with a manual that explains to you how to set up, maybe if it's a new computer, how to set up the new computer, how to connect everything and from scratch and up to make it running. The same thing happens to the software documentation. When you're trying to write a documentation for your software, you'll have to make sure that you explain each thing step by step, so that it will be easier for the user who is using your product to understand how it perfectly operates. The same way when you purchase a TV, it gives you a detailed explanation from how to power it on, how to mount it on the wall, and how to set up the channels and everything. The same thing, you should apply that when you are developing your project. So we have two types of documentation. We have the product documentation and the process documentation. Product documentation is the documentation that gives you the guidance on how a product is used and how you should be able to use it from setting it up to the moment it fully functions. And process documentation is the example that I've given, like, let's say, like mounting a TV. It gives you the process from unboxing it, what should be done, how everything should be connected together, how the wire should be connected, and till till the moment where it gives you the instructions of you mounting it on the wall. So that's a good example of process documentation. It gives you a guidance on a step-by-step on everything that should be done from start to the end till you see that your product is fully functional. And when writing documentations, we have some guidelines which we should follow. For example, a documentation should be from the point of view of the reader. When you're writing a documentation, write the documentation from the point of the reader. What do I mean by this? Let's say I'm trying to write a documentation about a product that I'm trying to develop. Since from my end, I know exactly what the product does, how to set it up from start and everything. Now, when I'm trying to write the documentation, I will need to write the documentation assuming that I have no idea or clue about anything relating to the product. I will have to assume that the person purchasing the product has never come across it, and they will need to know how exactly it operates. That's what we mean by you should write it from a reader point of view. You'll have to assume that you know nothing about it. It's your first time trying to encounter it. How will you explain it to a person who has no prior knowledge to the product? That's what we mean by this point. There should be no repetition. So whenever you are writing your documentation, be sure you are clear. Don't repeat yourself. For example, when writing code, there's no need for you to go ahead and repeat. Let's say you have a code in the introduction part explaining how to set up, let's say Docz, for example. If you move ahead to another part of your project, there's no need for you to repeat the code again. For example, you can use a reference like to set up Docz in this reference to page so and so. It will give you a clear guidance of how to set up the product instead of you performing repetition over and over in your documentation. And the last guideline, your documentation should be always updated. Well, when developing softwares, time to time we tend to update the softwares, add new features. Now, whenever we add new features, we should be able to ensure that the documentation we have out to the internet is up to date with all the details that we have added in, so that the viewers or the users who are trying to access it or read it are able to understand exactly what the documentation is all about, and they're up to date with all the new features that have been added in it. So, what are the do's that you should follow when writing a documentation? What are the do's that you should keep in mind when you're trying to write a documentation for your product? Well, for example, for the first point, define the target audience, the tone, the style, and the technicality you will use. When writing a documentation for this instant, before you begin writing your documentation, it is highly advised that you define your target audience, the tone you will use, the style, and the technicality you will use. All this depends on the audience you will be targeting. Well, when writing a documentation, most of the products, we have different types of audience. We have the young, we have the old, all lie in different age groups. Now, depending on the target audience that you are targeting with your product, you should make sure that the tone and the language you use is able to favor that age group or that target audience per se, so that they won't be having any difficulties when they try to learn or when they try to follow along the documentation that you provided. Another point is you should understand the product that you are writing the documentation for. So most of the time, I tend to believe that if you are writing a documentation for a product, you must have interacted with it, you must have used it, you must have run it through different test levels, so that you be sure that you are familiar with the product. In short, when writing a documentation, make sure the product that you're trying to write a documentation for is well understood to yourself, you have used it before, and so that it will be easier for you to explain to another person who has no prior knowledge to the product how to go along with it. So if you want to write a great documentation, the first step is for you to be sure you understand how the product functions. If you don't even know how something is supposed to work, you can't have much confidence that it's working correctly. Plus, it creates uncertainty amongst teams about the working of the project. So be sure that you have a clear understanding of how exactly the project you're trying to write the documentation for exactly functions. Point number 3, the structure that you'll be taking in order to write a good documentation. So the structure and markup that you'll be using when writing the documentation. Structure your documentation by task relevant to the user instead of providing reference documentation by describing each part of the user interface individually. Always describe what a product can do rather than its limitations. You can follow this. For example, to better explain this point, I'm sure we have all interacted with some ebooks online. Whenever we purchase an ebook, it always has a section that has the table of content part. This means that whoever wrote the book had a structure in mind. He had the introduction part. After the introduction, he had the acknowledgement part. After the acknowledgement, he had the table of contents, which further gives the details that are listed in the book. The same thing should happen whenever you are trying to write a documentation. After having the introduction part and all the other basic introduction to the product you are trying to write a documentation for, it is highly recommended that you have something in the structure of a table of content that will give quick reference to the user to a specific part if the user would like to quickly switch to that part. So be sure to follow us. Make sure you have a structure that will guide you whenever you are writing a documentation to avoid inconveniences to the user when they try to reach or when they try to reference a specific part of your documentation. Point number 4, make use of diagrams and graphic materials. So provide diagrams or other graphic materials to help understand and communicate the structure and design principles. So let's say you're trying to write a documentation, and in the documentation it has some execution or some output after running it. Be sure to include a sample output so that the user will be able to follow along. Let's say if the user is trying to, for example, install Docz in the project, whenever, let's say, for example, in the documentation of Docz, we have a sample diagram that shows us the message that is expected if Docz successfully runs in our project. The same thing should be done in your documentation for your project. Try to include code snippets, diagrams, pictures of outputs that are expected if successfully the product or the program executes to the end. Try to give the user something to follow along in a manner that the user will be able to know that if I try to run this product and I don't see this window that has been displayed in the documentation, I will for sure have a problem with my installation process. So I have to go ahead and begin afresh till I get this particular graphic diagram that has been given here. So that's the importance of diagrams. They help guide the user what is expected of them if something successfully happens or if it doesn't successfully install or load for that instance. Another point is the language that you'll be using. So we all come from different parts of the world. We all come from different time zones. We speak different languages. And this does not mean that you need to translate your code into vernaculars. Write your documentation in English because English is the most commonly spoken language worldwide and it will work in everybody's favor. So writing your documentation in English will be a good practice. Don't write your documentation maybe, for example, in your local language because most people won't understand it and you're trying to reach a greater audience by your documentation. So be sure to use a widely spoken language so that people will be able to follow along easily. Definition of terms. So whenever you are writing a documentation, you will be tempted to use some terms that may not be familiar to the user. So be sure to spare a section of your documentation that will be able to explain the terms that you have used, all the acronyms that you have used in reference to your documentation. Sparing a section and maybe name it abbreviation or definition of terms in your documentation will come in handy to a person who has no idea what that term means, but will be able to refer to that section and will have the knowledge of exactly what that term means. And finally, add sample codes. So whenever you are writing a documentation, for example, in this case, when you are using Docz, to write your documentation, be sure to include sample codes that a person or the customer trying to access it won't have the need to copy it or to write it from scratch, in this case, they will be able to go and copy the code and paste it in their maybe terminal or their working environment, and everything will be running smoothly. There's no need for the person to go ahead and begin writing the code all the way from scratch, and you have the ability to give them ease or reduce that process of them writing the code by providing sample codes that will be easily copied from your documentation to their terminal, for example. So those are some of the do's that you should keep in mind when writing a documentation, plus many other practices. Also make sure that your documentation is eye-catchy, because writing a documentation is like I will compare writing a documentation like writing an article. You'll always want your article to be eye-catchy and appealing to the person who is reading it, and the person also should be able to follow along. So the same principles that are applied when writing an article should be the same principles that will be followed when writing a documentation. Be simple, don't use complicated terms, and if you use complicated terms, be sure to explain them in the definition of terms section. More tips that will help you in writing a good documentation to your users. Define the purpose of your project documentation. What is the purpose of your project? Why are you writing the project? Why are you writing the documentation of your project? Are you trying to get a wide number of users to use your product? Are you trying to educate people about what exactly your product does? Or you're trying to send awareness of your product? Have a purpose of writing a documentation before you begin. Remember to add technology used in the creation of the product. Well, we all code in different languages. We all use different technologies. So whenever you write a documentation, chances are that you'll have to include the technologies you have used. So for example, if I were to write a documentation for myself to other people, the technologies that I will most probably use in this case will be maybe Python or Django. I'll be sure to include that in the documentation so that a person will be able to easily understand that the kind of product that I'm trying to access, or the kind of product that I am trying to use has been built using Python and Django, or has been built using Java and let's say any other framework that you're comfortable with, or has been built using PHP. So this comes in handy to the user. It will give them first-hand information and knowledge that the kind of project I'm trying to tackle now has been created using this kind of technology. Another point, you should also remember to document the unexpected events that may occur. So for example, when most of the time when we try to install, let's say, softwares from online, even though we follow the documentation, most of the documentation don't list the unexpected errors that might occur. So for example, in this case, I will give an example, the one that I've been trying to run of recent. As I was trying to install Docker, I was following the documentation, but along the way, I couldn't be able to install it because I encountered some few errors here and there. But through Googling, I was able to fix that. Now, if the Docker documentation could have explained to me that during the installation, you might be able to incur these and these challenges, or you might be able to face this and this, and this is how you should fix it, that will really have helped me and will have saved me much time of going to the internet and trying to search for that. So whenever you write a documentation, be sure to explain, for example, if when running your documentation or when running your software on, let's say, Windows, you might incur these challenges, and this is how you are expected to fix them. When running your software in Mac or Linux operating system, these are the challenges that you might occur, and this is how you should fix them. So be sure to include that part in your documentation. It will really save time for the person trying to use your product and for the person trying to read along your documentation. And the last tip, remember to backup. Well, I'm sure that even though you might have published your documentation online, having a backup is really important thing because you never know what might happen. Having a backup is a really important thing, and you should keep that in mind, not only for the documentation part, but also whenever you are developing your projects, whenever you are trying to create something new or to write something, be sure to have a backup just in case something happens. You never know what might happen. So be sure to always have a backup with you. Moving forward to the documentation softwares we have in the market today. So we have the likes of Storybook, we have the likes of Docz, we have Tooljet, we have Expo, we have Docz, just to mention a few. Those are some of the documentations softwares we have in the market today. So out of all the listed documentation you can see here, our main focus today will be specifically on Docz, because that's what we'll be talking about. So why Docz? Why should you consider Docz over the other softwares we have in the market today? Well, one of the first reason you should consider to use Docz over the other is that Docz it's powered by Gatsby, and it's easily customizable, it's fast, and it's based on MDX. It supports TypeScript, and it's SEO friendly, meaning it's SEO friendly and readable, meaning using it is really advantageous to you. So when writing a documentation, it is important for you as a project maintainer to know the kind of software that you'll be using. Docz is a very nice documentation generator because it enables interactive documentation for your React components in a very little effort. You wouldn't have to do much when using Docz because you'll have almost everything generated for you. All you need to do is follow along the guidance that has been given and do your part of writing a very detailed documentation, and the rest Docz will handle for you. Docz uses MDX. By MDX is the short form for Markdown with JSX, which brings the React component to the Markdown files from the prototypes and flow types of TypeScript types. It can generate property tables to document properly how to use your components. In addition, you can provide a coding playground, which is enabled when writing documentation using Docz for your components, so that anyone can see them in action, modify the code and see the changes live, or copy the snippet to use somewhere else. So that's another advantage of Docz. It gives you a chance to use a coding playground in your documentation in such a manner that anybody who reads along the documentation is able to play along the code samples that you have given there, and the instance, and is able to see the results instantly on the documentation itself. The person won't have to copy the code, maybe let's say to his or her code editor, in order to see the changes. The changes will be visible there immediately. Plus, it also gives you an opportunity for you to copy the code snippets and use them somewhere else. Let's say, for example, in your project or in your terminal if you are trying to install something using Docz. So that being said, why you should prefer Docz over the other softwares?